Hi everyone, I am Jeff Lawton. I'm going to look at a game from today's Magnus Carlsen Invitational. It was the semi-final and it was the fourth and deciding game between the world champion Magnus Carlsen, had the black pieces against Ding Liren, who was playing white, and it was a really tense match. They drew the first, and in the second game Magnus blundered when he wasn't particularly under pressure, but he just blundered. Like the third game where again Ding Liren's turn to blunder this time, and then we reached this fourth game, and the tension really was palpable, and the score's 1.5 all, and either of the players wins, they win the match. So Ding with white, he opened with d4. It's a 15-minute game, by the way, and 10-second increments. We had c4, c6, knight to f3. Knight to f6, we've got a Slav defense. Knight c3, e6, that's the full Slav if you like, e3, knight b to d7. And now sort of a slow line from Ding with bishop to e2, bishop to d6, and castles for white. Castles for Carlsen as well. And now b3 from Ding, sort of intending to develop with a fianchetto. b6, bishop b2, bishop to b7. And now a4, which was met by a5 from Magnus, and bishop d3 developing, rook c8, queen, I say developing, is sort of making way for his queen, queen e2, and c5. So this allows the knight in, which Ding did straight away, knight b5, bishop to b8, and again the second knight in with knight e5. And already the position has become a bit tricky for black, because any captures on of either this pawn, white intends to capture back with the pawn, or if this pawn again, white captures back with the e pawn and sort of maintains two pawns here and here, and it sort of gives white good chances with his knights like this. So Magnus had to start using time up here to decide how to basically to defend. He played queen e7, and then again the natural move f4 by Ding, attacking. Magnus, after some thought, captured on c4. We have b takes c4, and here a strong defensive move, knight to e4. So this is black's best placed piece at the moment. And now we had rook a to d1, hoping for some failed threats against the knight on d7 if the d file cleared. And we had rook c to d8, so straight away Carlsen's alert to the danger. And he can now use his rook to capture on d7. And then we had bishop to a3 from Ding. Now, an interesting idea was the move d5. I'll just show a line just almost really for the sake of a sort of rather strange looking move, or wonderful looking move I should say. After ed5, bishop e4, de4, knight d7, rook d7. Looks like white's just thrown away a pawn, but there's then the sort of semi-amazing move bishop f6. If you take it this way, you run into queen g4 check, forking the king and the rook. Of course, because the rook's here, white wins the rook, and therefore emerges with an exchange ahead. And if instead of that you play queen f6, then you just walk into rook d7, again with an exchange ahead. So the best move for black, as it turns out, is queen here first, and after f5, queen f6, rook d7. Although Carlsen said he missed this whole idea for white, in the interview afterwards he quickly said, but this is okay for black, no worries there. So, although it's an exchange down, the black bishops are good, and the knight, it's a bit out of play over here at the moment. This bishop particularly is good on this diagonal. So Ding didn't play that. After quite some thought really, he played bishop a3, now intensifying the pressure on the c5 pawn on this diagonal. So Magnus clarified the situation, gets some air for his pieces, knight e5, knight takes e5 I should say, fe5, and now the good reply f5. So this would be out of the question for white. If we just stop and look at this a minute, all of a sudden the roles would have reversed completely. Both the black bishops are raking down here For example, if white tries to get his own bishop back onto this strong diagonal, then black can strike with bishop h2 check, king h2, rook f1, and then queen h4 check. And this turns out to be very good for black. King g1, there's knight g3, and we can't go queen f2 because it's checkmate. And there's no square for the queen over here. Of course, the bishop's raking along here. And if you play, say, queen d2, then queen h1 check, king f2, knight f1, bishop f takes f1, then rook f8 check. It's going to win the bishop back, or if you want, you can, for good measure, just play g5, and now there's no answer to queen h4, which would be checkmate. So white, this would be a very silly move to make anyway, to be honest, because it just opens up the bishop here. So instead of that, Ding played rook to b1, now deciding that there's nothing else happening on the d file, so he repositions the rook. We had queen g5. So now the worst of the opening is over for Magnus, really, and he's got a good knight here. And there's not especially any particular reason to think he might be worse. I wouldn't have thought. And then we played rook b2, and now rook f7. And here Carlsen did win a very good chance here. A good opportunity arose to play f4. And then after rook f4, rook takes f4, ef4, queen f4. The point now is that he's undermined, or would have undermined, the pawn on d4. So black's simply able to take this next move if given the opportunity. And it's hard for white to defend. You certainly can't play dc5, of course, because just then bishop e5 hits the pawn on h2, and also the rook here. So that would be hopeless for white. So basically his pawn centre would fall apart. But like Magnus said, he wasn't really looking for active moves because he was just relieved to have swapped a pair of knights off and got rid of a strong knight on e5, and then he can sort of look to defend. He's actually got some breathing space for his pieces now. So we had queen e1, and then we had rook f to d7, and then we had rook to e2. So we had h6, and I think round about here, Ding was about a minute or so ahead on the clock. I think they had roughly down to around 5 minutes each, so maybe it was about 4v5 or 5v4, I should say. And we had bishop to b2 and bishop to c6. And we have bishop to c2, just taking the bishop off the exposed d line where Carlsen is poised to strike with his rooks. And now king h8. And now rook f3, a sort of a nice rook lift. But it does allow an interesting tactic, which it appears as if Ding intended to do it. He sort of missed the move knight. He allowed the move knight c3, which wins an exchange, because if you capture this, then bishop takes rook wins the exchange due to the pin on the g pawn here. And after knight c3, I mean any other move, we either capture this rook, or if you move this one, for example, we just take the other rook. So whatever you do, it's an exchange up for black. But Carlsen played queen g6. He hadn't spotted it at this point. We had rook h3, and queen to g5, rook to f3, and sort of possibly a repetition is going to occur in a draw, and then they go into extra time, two blitz games. This time Carlsen saw the opportunity and played knight c3, and here was Ding's idea of d5. Really a very nice idea indeed. So now the knight's under attack, so it has to take the rook, which is what Magnus wanted to do anyway. Knight e2, queen takes e2, and now he played bishop b7. And the wonderful point to Ding's idea is that after ed5, he intended rook takes f5, and now after queen back to e7, we can then play queen g4, and with this diagonal now open, one of white's ideas is simply to play queen to g6 followed by rook f8 check, and whatever you capture with, it's then checkmate. thanks to the support of the bishop here. So it's after ed5, rook f5, we could have queen e7, and after queen g4, for example, if white, well, black has to try and close these diagonals to the bishops. They're both raking over here, almost like the way that Kasparov used to play against Karpov in one of the Lopez games I recall in their match. And so say you try and block off this diagonal with d4, then there's the move ed4, cd4. Somewhat surprisingly, white can just play bishop to d3, stopping the pawn from advancing, and then this is sort of very hard to stop. So you can't play queen e6 to stop it, of course, because rook f8 is check, followed by just taking the on-pre queen. And if you do, say, queen e8 instead to block queen g6, then we can play e6 for white. And then after bishop takes b5, cb5, say you played rook d6, for example, because rook e7 also runs into a very strong move with bishop a3, and then rook here would drop the queen. And if instead of that, rook to d6, we can then play queen e4. And again, there's a threat now of playing rook to f8, followed by queen h7 mate. And this is clearly not something black wants to be doing, really. And after g6 in this position, queen e5 check, king h7, rook f7 check, and it's all over. Black has to give his queen up there. So Magnus, sort of seeing some of that, played bishop to b7, perhaps saw all of it, but they were both very short of time by now. And then we had rook to g3, queen to h4, and now d6. So this is where in the interview Magnus said that he was already, by here he was regretting his decision to play knight c3. Yes, he's won the exchange, but the fantastic pawn centre for Ding. I think the main thing is that it keeps it closed, which means that the rooks don't operate so well. They need open files, and on the other hand, the bishop here is also well and truly blocked in. So it's a very difficult position, and white's piece is again sort of trying to target the king's side where it's easier for him to attack. Even so, it's hard for white to break through, so we'll see what happened. We had bishop e4 trying to relieve the pressure with exchanges of the bishops, but Ding had none of that. Bishop to d1, bishop back to c6, and rook to h3. We had queen g5, rook hits the queen again, queen to h4, and now rook h3, queen g5. So Ding could happily take happily or unhappily perhaps take the repetition with rook g3, but he plays knight c3 instead, which is a very interesting attempt to play on. And I remember Magnus said after the game that although on the one hand, clearly Ding's playing for a win, he said he was pleased to see this particular move because it provokes a crisis, so it makes black's moves easier to play when your opponent forces the issue. But it's a really fascinating manoeuvre, and Ding's idea is to move his queen and then bring the knight round to here, where on f4, I think we can manoeuvre it there. On f4, the idea is that, sorry, let's just get this to work. We can play the knight to here, and then on this square it will then be targeting e6 and also possibilities of g6. And it's difficult for black to counter this, even though it looks slow. It's very hard to counter because the pawns are just blocking all his pieces, and there's no source of counterplay for the rooks. So we had rook to f8, and then queen f2, and then we had queen back to d8, still trying to defend. Again, perhaps f4 was worth consideration, trying to open it up before white blocks that off. But we had queen d8. Of course, this is all very short of time, I should add. We had knight e2 and king h7. So I think Carlsen was down to less than a minute here, and Ding had about perhaps only a minute and a half to 2 minutes himself. We had knight f4, and Magnus played bishop d6. It's almost almost desperation really, because he just can't allow white to carry on without doing something. I mean, if you play rook e8, it just isn't possible at the moment because of knight e6 attacking the queen. Rook e6, then queen f5 check. Now the rook must go to g6 because it was attacked, but then bishop to c2, and then again there's a deadly threat to the rook on this diagonal. And if you defend it with queen e8, only piece that can defend it really, then rook g3, and it's attacked 3 times now by the rook, queen, and the bishop indirectly, only defended once, twice really, but it's not enough. And after say queen f7, we could just play queen g4 even, followed by bishop takes rook, and white's completely winning with his pawns and all black's pieces boxed in there. So this is why Carlsen played bishop takes d6, and now we had knight e6. And this is where, like Magnus said after the game, he realised straight after knight e6 that he was safe at this point. So quite remarkable defensive insight, I think. But if Ding had played this move, then after rook takes d6, hitting the bishop, then bishop e2 would have kept an advantage for white really. But that didn't happen. Ding's short of time by now. Played knight takes e6. We had queen e8 from Carlsen, attacking the knight. We had knight takes f8, and now the attacked bishop can neatly take back on f8. So queen f5 check, and now g6, sort of a really nice defensive move. And we had queen f1 and bishop g7. And this is, I was watching the game thinking, this is so typically somehow a Carlsen, brilliant defensive effort. I know, it's true that Ding went wrong with knight e6, but it was very short of time. But it's almost like, Magnus places his pieces where they're going to be well placed. And again here, I mean, you look at all his pieces, they're just so well placed, and very well placed, in fact, compared to Ding's, and unless g6 can fall. But the bishop's defending the king well, the rook's on an open line here, and also this bishop is on a strung diagonal, and this is threatening to come in here, and the queen defends nicely here, so he's kept his pieces harmoniously grouped here. So Ding played a strong move, bishop to c2. Well, it looks strong because it attacks this, so actually it allowed, it's a strong looking move, but it allowed rook d2. And in this position, Ding resigned and congratulated Magnus on winning a really, really tense match. And the threat is, the reason he resigned is the bishop's being attacked. And if we move, well, we can't move it because then the other bishop would fall, or also black's threatening rook g2. So the only thing that white could really try is bishop takes g6, hoping for king takes, but of course we just played queen takes, rook g3, and then after a safe move, queen h5, threatening rook d1. There's no perpetual after rook g7, king g7, queen f6 check, king g8, and now queen here check, the only check, queen f7, and alright, so black's now a rook up. If white tries taking the bishop, rook d1 would be mate. So Ding resigned and Magnus was triumphant, and he said after the match, I'll just have a quick look at one or two of the quotes I wrote down. He said, he was talking about the tension, of how bad the tension was, because he said he hadn't felt this tense during a match for ages, and you could see it in both the players on the webcams. And it said that he felt like he did after game 10 against Caruana in the London match, World Championship match. I think that was the game with that really, really tense ending. I think it was. I haven't gone back to check that. And he said, I think I've basically got away with something akin to murder. So I'll put those quotes. And he said Ding was very polite after the game. He said, and all credit to him, he just congratulated Magnus afterwards, despite his own obvious disappointment, having had such many chances really to beat Magnus in this match. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thanks for watching. If you did enjoy it, please subscribe and subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thanks very much. Bye now.